I'm Mike, and today I'm talking about this arcade behind me. So without further ado, let's go ahead and check it out. I've been wanting to do an arcade for a while, but they're all pretty expensive if you want to get a decent one. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to get a decent one. I kind of wanted to see how it would be to have one without breaking the bank. So for the longest time, I didn't want to settle for just doing like a tabletop thing, but I kept seeing this Atari one pop up on Amazon. And I realized recently it was actually sold through Micro Center. It's actually a Micro Center branded one. Obviously they partner with Atari for it, and it comes with 90 games. And I went ahead and got it because it was $130. And this is the version that includes the Raspberry Pi. There's also another version that doesn't have a Raspberry Pi included. There's only $10 less, so I was like, for $10 extra, I might as well get the Raspberry Pi. There's also an even bigger version that has a trackball in the middle. That's probably gonna be a little bit better for 2 players because this is a little bit cramped. But overall, this thing's been pretty cool so far. The one thing that's kind of cool about it is it uses standard controls, so you can really, if you want to, open this up, which you can very easily. It actually comes with 2 keys, and there's just a little keyhole in the front, and you twist it to open it. You can actually swap these out for pretty much any controls that you want as long as they fit this size. From my understanding, I think this is a pretty standard size for arcade controls, so if you actually don't like them, you can switch them out. The construction of the box is really good. It has these hydraulic lifts. And everything in here was very nice and tidy inside the box. The controls, the buttons aren't the best. They definitely feel better than anything you would get with like an arcade one-up machine, at least the ones I've tried in the store. But they are a bit jiggly, a little bit loose. They're not as firm, but they still work. Overall, the controls feel really good, and I've actually been enjoying like going back and playing a lot of these retro games. The joystick especially up here, I think the joystick is exceptional. The buttons, like I said, are all right. They're pretty good, but the joystick, I think, up here feels great. So if you want to, you could technically get this for the Atari games, but that's not why I got it. The reason I chose this is because it's $130. It came with the Raspberry Pi 3B, which is not the newest one, but it's still good enough to play a lot of classic games. And it's fairly easy to go ahead and just mod this thing. So basically it's just running a version of Retropie where they just put custom like Atari loading screens and icons and stuff in it, but it's still just like a pre-configured version of Retropie. So all you have to do is just go in the settings and enable like custom game collections, and then it'll show everything, like, you know, show SNES and NES and Sega Master System, and then you can go in there and you can put whatever legally obtained ROMs you may have on there to play. Now this whole setup, this desk is actually just a $40 desk from Target. They just call it a compact desk. And then I got like a $15 monitor mount from Amazon, which actually doesn't fit this desk. So I had to use the part that you would normally use to clamp onto a desk instead of like, you know, screwing through it. I took off the back of the clamp and I screwed the clamp part into the back of this desk. So it's a little bit ghetto. I would recommend, you know, not doing that. You could probably just use a regular monitor stand. I was just trying to be too fancy, but yeah, that's what I did. I made it a little bit ghetto, okay? That's a part of the charm. And then this monitor itself, I actually was given this. It was being thrown away, but it's like a 24-inch Samsung monitor. It only has DisplayPort and DVI. If you can get a monitor that has HDMI and built-in speakers for relatively cheap, I do recommend that, because I had to configure the speakers to work over USB, so I ended up buying speakers externally because this monitor doesn't have speakers at all. And then since the Raspberry Pi doesn't have like, or at least this one doesn't have an aux port, I had to use a USB adapter to 3.5 millimeter and then plug my speakers in there. And then you have to do an additional setup in the settings in order to use sound over USB. If you can avoid that whole headache, I do recommend it, and just try to find an older, cheaper monitor that has HDMI. They shouldn't be that expensive at this point, especially if you get like a smaller one, like a 19-inch. No one wants those anymore, so maybe you can get one with built-in speakers, or at least a monitor that has a built-in audio jack, so you can plug the speakers directly into the monitor. The light on top of here is actually just a really cheap Walmart light. That was like $8 that I've had for over a year. And it's just a really basic light. Like, it has a remote to change the color. And then, so if I wanted to do red or something like that, that's not a very bright red, but you know, it gives you the options. It lets you change the color. Yeah, it's a really low power light. It's USB powered. So I just plugged it into the Raspberry Pi, so that way when this turns on, the light will turn on, and it saves whatever the last setting you had on for it is. I actually forgot about the speakers. So the speakers are actually just some $25 Logitech speakers that I got at Best Buy. So without the monitor, that brings the whole setup to $200. So overall, the reason I chose this is because I'm lazy. You pretty much get a pre-assembled box with the controls, with the Raspberry Pi already in. You do have to install the Raspberry Pi OS, or at least I did, right out of the box, so you will need a mouse and keyboard hooked up. I actually just keep a wireless mouse and keyboard under here in the desk, because if you do your own custom ROMs, there's gonna be a lot of those times where you have to crawl back into the menus. But the cool thing about this is if you do want to do this arcade machine, and you can kind of skimp on some parts and spend more on the other, and you could probably even build it cheaper than I did. I just happened to get a free monitor. I would definitely say if you want to look for a cheap monitor, maybe look on like Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, whatever you kids are doing these days. I think it's worth it in a lot of ways. For one, if you've been curious about like a Raspberry Pi arcade, but you don't want to spend a bunch of money on it, if you get this, you're already getting arcade sticks. It's not like you can't reuse them in other builds or anything. And then plus you're getting a Raspberry Pi. It's not the latest and greatest, but it's definitely something to get your hands wet and mess around with. I hadn't messed around with a Raspberry Pi before this. I've played around with other Linux-based things, but not a Raspberry Pi specifically, and I've been having a lot of fun with it, and I would definitely consider upgrading it to the 4, or perhaps even doing a Windows build with this same setup in the future. The thumbsticks just connect to a USB board like most of the third-party ones. They sell them like Amazon and eBay do, so you can plug it into a Windows machine. You can pretty much plug it into any machine, so by buying this, you're not just stuck with a Raspberry Pi. You can really upgrade it and do whatever you want to with it. The Raspberry Pi is just kind of a nice added bonus, and it's kind of cool to just have like 90 games, whether or not I want to play them or not. I'm not an Atari kid. I'm not that old. I'm an NES kid, so still old, but not that old. That's not my generation. I don't really vibe with Atari like that, but I think it was a pretty good deal for the price. It's on sale, or at least it was when I bought it, for $130. I think I generally seen it around that price. The box at $150 on there, so I guess that's like the maximum price for it. I saw the bigger version for $200, but overall I think this is worth it. It's still cheaper than buying like an arcade 1-up machine, which is kind of like the standard, and then they also generally only play a few games, even though you can mod them to add games. This is a lot easier to mod. It's like set up for it pretty much. And then on top of that, the controllers feel a lot better, and there's just a lot more customizability. Like you can do whatever you want to with the setup, and that's what makes this kind of cool. So that's my thoughts on this Atari weird joystick thing that Microsoft makes that I bought from Amazon. But if you enjoyed this video, then make sure to tell a friend, tell a coworker, like, share, and subscribe, and always do at least 2 things at the same time. Peace.